3 years. That's how long Brooke Sullivan had been invisible at Oak Creek Memorial in Norfolk. 3 years since the Navy sent her a letter that didn't use her name, just a case number and a single word, disappeared. She hadn't trembled when she read it. She'd folded the paper into thirds, placed it in a drawer beside her service record that no longer existed, and showed up for the morning shift like always. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as she moved through the corridors, badge clipped to her scrubs, hand steady as she checked for lines and monitored vitals. Her forearms bore marks that told stories, thin white lines from shrapnel, one longer scar that curved like a question mark. She kept them covered under long sleeves, even in summer. The hospital asked no questions. Nurses wore long sleeves sometimes. It meant nothing. Every morning before shift, Brooke touched the faded unit patch sewn deep inside her jacket lining, the only proof she'd ever been anything other than just another RN pushing medications and documenting patient observations. The fabric was rough now, worn soft by 3 years of her fingers finding it in the dark. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. She'd been Dark Horse 6 months ago. She was nobody now. That was the point. Oak Creek Memorial occupied a corner of Norfolk's medical district, all glass and steel and the kind of determined efficiency that came from treating everything from cardiac arrests to administrative complaints with equal urgency. The morning light cut through the windows at an angle that made everything look temporary, even the nurses who'd worked there for decades. Even the patients. Brooke's shift began at 0700, same as every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 36 months. She clocked in at the nursing station, collected her assignment from the charge nurse without eye contact, and moved her body through the morning routine with the kind of precision that came from having once performed field surgery in sandstorms with rounds coming through tent fabric. Checking orders. Running labs. Pulling medications with a focus so complete that it looked like deference. "Sullivan, you've got for North today," the charge nurse said, not looking up from the computer. "Webb in consultation when he arrives. Pre-cardiac workup. You'll need to get him settled and bring him around 0900. Brooke nodded. Standard assignment. She'd moved patients through this hospital so many times the routes had worn grooves in her memory. 3rd floor, consultation wing, room 407. She could do it asleep. What she didn't expect was recognition. The call came through at 0845. Wheelchair-bound transfer from the main entrance, Colonel Marcus Webb, retired, arriving with his daughter Rachel for a cardiac catheterization consult. Brooke's hands froze for exactly 1 second at the nurse's station. 1 second. Then she moved. Colonel Marcus Webb. She knew that name the way soldiers know the names of commanders they trust with their lives. She'd served under him once, not directly, but near enough. Special Forces chain of command was a small network of interlocking operations, and Colonel Webb had been the commanding officer of her son Derek's unit. Charlie Platoon, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The same battalion. The same province. Helmand. It had been 5 years since the black operation had gone sideways, since her entire unit had been erased from official records and told to disappear. 16 months since Derek had stopped calling. Brooke hadn't allowed herself to think about why. She collected the transfer paperwork from the front desk volunteer, moved to the main lobby, and found Colonel Webb exactly where she expected, a tall man, weathered, with the kind of posture that military retirement hadn't managed to soften. His daughter stood beside the wheelchair, her hand on his shoulder with the weight of someone holding up more than just a body. "Colonel Webb." Brooke's voice came out level, professional, the voice of a nurse who'd performed this 1,000 times. "I'm going to get you settled. Follow me." She didn't acknowledge the moment his eyes met hers. She didn't let the recognition register on her face. She simply took the wheelchair handles, smooth under her palms, the kind of texture that grounded you in the present moment, and pushed him toward the consultation wing. The corridor stretched long and fluorescent lit. Linoleum under the wheelchair wheels made a soft rolling sound, rhythmic as a heartbeat. Rachel walked on the colonel's left, her face tight with worry. Webb was in a gown already, his dog tags visible against the fabric. They caught the light as the wheelchair moved, little flashes of metal and history. Brooke's eyes didn't leave the back of his head. Not his tags. Never the tags. Room 407 was standard-issue consultation space. Exam table, wall-mounted monitor, tray of sterile instruments nobody would use for another hour. Brooke locked the wheelchair, helped Webb from the chair onto the exam table with movements that suggested she'd done this 1,000 times, because she had. She'd moved men far more damaged than this, men with shrapnel in their lungs, missing limbs, eyes that had seen things that broke the glass inside the skull. Moving a retired colonel into a hospital gown was simple by comparison. "Doctor will be with you in just a moment," she said, handing Rachel a clipboard. "Any questions before we start?" Rachel shook her head. Webb was reading the monitor beside his bed, his mind already somewhere else. "Good." Brooke checked the 4-axis, tight, no infiltration, and made a note in the chart. "Everything by protocol. Everything invisible." She was leaving when Dr. Hargrove arrived. He came through the door moving with the kind of purpose that had nothing to do with actual urgency and everything to do with status. White coat, stethoscope draped like a scarf, and behind him, 2 surgical residents trying to match his stride. Hargrove was the type of doctor who made people feel smaller just by being in the same room, not because of any particular skill, but because he'd mastered the art of making his own importance impossible to ignore. He was maybe 50, maybe younger, with the kind of precision-cut hair that required maintenance and the kind of watch that cost more than Brooke made in 2 months. His eyes passed over her like she was part of the hospital furniture, important enough to not run into, not important enough to actually see. "And here's our nurse who thinks reading WEBMD qualifies her to question my treatment plans," Hargrove said to his residents, not breaking stride. He still hadn't washed his hands. Brooke watched the oversight the way she'd learned to watch everything, silently, completely, cataloging it like data. Rachel stiffened. Webb's jaw tightened, the muscles visible at his temple. Hargrove didn't acknowledge either reaction. He was already scanning the chart, his residents flanking him like satellites. One of them, a young woman with careful handwriting on her white coat, glanced at Brooke with something that might have been sympathy. She looked away. 68-year-old male, cardiac history, presenting for routine catheterization, Hargrove announced, his voice calibrated to fill the room. Not quite loud enough to be unprofessional. Loud enough that everyone within 30 feet would know exactly what he thought of his nurse. "Let's see if we can determine why he's had 3 separate episodes of arrhythmia in the past 18 months. He began his examination without any introduction to the patient beyond a curt nod. No eye contact. No introduction to Rachel. Brooke watched his hands move over Webb's chest, feeling for what the monitor had already told him. His stethoscope found the heartbeat, she could see it in his posture, the way his shoulders relaxed slightly. Something in there was still working, despite whatever had brought him to this room. "I have a documented penicillin allergy," Webb said quietly. His voice had the rough quality of someone who wasn't used to repeating himself. "Anaphylaxis. The chart should." Yes, I see it," Hargrove interrupted, not bothering to look at the chart. He was already turning to his residents. "Standard allergy profile. Nothing that will impact the procedure." Brooke's hand moved before her brain caught up, muscle memory, the kind that came from 5 years of watching doctors kill people through inattention. "His allergy threshold is severe, doctor. The contrast agents in the catheterization suite." The eye roll was theatrical. Hargrove turned to face her, his expression arranged in something that wasn't quite a smile, the kind of facial arrangement that got practiced in the mirror. "The contrast agents don't contain penicillin, nurse. Perhaps if you'd completed medical school instead of a 2-year program, you'd understand basic pharmacology." He held her gaze for exactly 1 second, long enough to make his point, not so long that it seemed like confrontation. Perfectly calibrated disrespect. His resident snickered. The young woman looked away again. Brooke didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She stood there with the chart still in her hands and her face arranged in the expression she'd perfected over 3 years, perfect professional neutrality. Not defiant. Not hurt. Not anything that would give him the satisfaction of reaction. Her hand stayed steady as surgical lasers. "Understood, doctor," she said quietly. 3 words. Nothing more. But inside, deep in the places where she kept the classified things, the things that the Navy had erased from official records, something moved. Something that had been dormant for 5 years. Something that recognized the shape of disrespect and the texture of being invisible and knew exactly what it felt like to save people who had no idea you'd ever existed. Rachel was watching her now, and in the Colonel's eyes, something shifted. Acknowledgement, maybe. Or the first faint recognition that this particular nurse had just let a doctor dismiss a life-threatening allergy without breaking her composure, which suggested she might know something about composure that most people didn't. Hargrove was already moving on, his attention returning to the chart, his mind already occupied with whatever was important to men like him. Status. Protocol. The careful maintenance of the boundary between people who had power and people who were just passing through rooms holding clipboards. The procedures scheduled for 1100, he said to his residents, not the patient, not the nurse. We'll start with basic angiography, see if we can identify the arrhythmia source. If necessary, we'll move to ablation. He'll be fine. He'll be fine. As if confidence was equivalent to knowledge. As if the absence of doubt was the same as the presence of skill. Brooke waited until he'd left the room before she documented Webb's allergy status again, twice, on multiple systems where the contrast team would see it, where it couldn't be missed or dismissed by a white coat and an eye roll. She'd learned 3 years ago that some information couldn't be protected by protocol alone. Sometimes you had to build redundancy into the system. Sometimes you had to make safety matter more than hierarchy. When she left room 407, she could feel Webb watching her go. Could feel the moment Rachel made the connection, that look on her daughter's face that suggested she was trying to figure out who this nurse actually was, and why she'd fought for an allergy that didn't match her job description. Brooke didn't turn around. She had a shift to finish. She had invisibility to maintain. She had the faded unit patch in her jacket pocket waiting for her, proof of who she'd been, reminder of why she couldn't be that anymore, anchor to a life that the Navy had decided didn't exist. 3 years. That's how long she'd managed to stay disappeared. She didn't know that time was about to run out. The break room smelled like stale coffee and regret. Brooke sat alone at the center table, her ceramic mug cooling in front of her, watching the steam curl upward like smoke from a distant fire. She'd taken her break at the same time for 3 months, 12:52 to 1:07. A small window into the day when the noise stopped and the fluorescent lights felt less like judgment. The door swung open. Jennifer entered first, balancing a salad container and bottled water. Behind her came Marcus from cardiology, then Susan from the surgical floor, then old Tom who'd worked respiratory for 17 years and still knew everyone's business. They saw her. Jennifer's eyes flicked toward Brooke, then away. A beat passed, the kind of pause that holds a conversation. Tom glanced at Marcus. No words were needed. They adjusted their trajectory like planets following gravity, moving toward the far table by the windows where the afternoon light fell in bright rectangular panels across the formica. Jennifer mouthed something that might have been sorry. She didn't move. Brooke stared into her coffee. The liquid had turned the color of old pennies, oxidized and dull. She could hear their voices now, measured, careful, the way people talk when they're making a point without actually making it. This was the rhythm of professional exile. This was what happened when you filed paperwork that threatened the wrong person. 3 months earlier, she'd documented Hargrove's post-surgical infection rates. 7 cases in 6 months when the hospital average was 1. She'd typed it out in the formal patient safety incident report, attached supporting data, and sent it to the hospital quality department at 2 in the morning, thinking the hour might matter somehow, as if the middle of the night was a safer time for truth. By 7:30 a.m., Hargrove knew. By noon, she was invisible. By evening, she was toxic, the kind of colleague people ate lunch away from because proximity to her was proximity to conflict. She understood the calculus. Hargrove had 17 years of tenure, Connections to the board, a reputation built on surgical outcomes that looked good if you didn't look too closely. She had 3 years of keeping her head down and a history that didn't exist. The rational move was to accept the exile. Eat lunch alone. Document her work meticulously. Keep her composure. Disappear. But Colonel Marcus Webb was in room for 12, and Hargrove was walking toward him with the casual confidence of a man who'd never once been told no. The afternoon shift began at 2. Brooke pulled Webb's chart from the rack outside his room and scanned the orders. Her chest tightened. Cephalosporin Z-Pack, preoperative antibiotic, standard protocol for cardiac catheterization. And there, in red annotation on the front of his chart, documented by the admitting nurse herself, *** allergy, penicillin, anaphylaxis risk, prior reaction, throat closure, epinephrine required, ***. A cephalosporin was a penicillin derivative. Close enough to cause a reaction. Close enough to be catastrophic. She'd mentioned this to Hargrove already. In the consultation room, with residents watching. He dismissed her with the precision of a man who knew exactly how many people were listening and exactly how humiliated she'd feel. Brooke carried the chart to his office on the 4th floor. The corridor hummed with the ambient noise of a hospital running at capacity, phones ringing in distant rooms, a code blue announced overhead, "Not this unit, not her problem," the steady percussion of shoes on linoleum. His door was closed. She knocked once, heard his voice saying "Come in" with the tone of someone expecting subordination. Hargrove sat with his shoes on his desk, phone pressed to his ear, expensive leather soles pointed at the ceiling like a declaration. He gestured for her to wait, didn't end the call. She stood in the doorway, chart in both hands, and listened to him negotiate with someone named Morrison about a board vote schedule. "Tell Morrison I need this moved up," Hargrove said, his voice carrying the ease of a man making requests that became demands simply by being spoken. "The Sullivan problem needs handling before the next committee meeting." The Sullivan problem. He hung up and swiveled in his chair. "What now, Florence Nightingale?" She placed the chart on his desk. "Steady hands. One breath." "Colonel Webb's pre-op antibiotic," she said quietly, pointing to the cephalosporin order. "His documented penicillin anaphylaxis. This derivative could trigger a reaction." Hargrove didn't even look at the chart. "Then change it," he said, and returned to his phone, scrolling through emails. "I can't change it," Brooke said. "You ordered it." He looked up then, and his eyes had that quality that older predators develop, the kind of gaze that doesn't contain anger so much as the absence of any constraint that anger would provide. "You're right," he said. "You can't. So we'll find a nurse who can." He turned his chair away from her, dismissing her from the room by simply no longer acknowledging her presence. She didn't move. "Sir, I can't administer that medication. Not to that patient. Not with that allergy. Get out of my office." She left. But Hargrove had already picked up his phone. Within the hour, he'd made 3 calls. Morrison from the hospital board. The nursing program director at Old Dominion University. The hospital's chief of staff. He'd used the words liability, insubordination, pattern of behavior, and refusal to follow physician orders. He'd attached all 3 written warnings to an email. He documented everything so meticulously that the noise of his voice had become an institutional apparatus, a formal structure that could move against her regardless of what he actually said next. Jennifer found her near the supply closet at 3:45. Just pulled her aside, one hand on her elbow, voice dropping to something that approximated a whisper even though there was no one in the hallway to hear it. "He's calling in big guns," Jennifer said. Her eyes were bright with the particular anxiety of a person caught between compassion and self-preservation. "Morrison from the board is coming tomorrow. I heard him on the phone with the administrator. He said your name. He said the words liability risk." Brooke's hands moved toward the supply cart, gripped the cool metal frame. The sensation of texture was grounding, real in a way words were not. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Brooke, Jennifer stopped. Started again. I don't know what's happening, but it's not going to be good. You should talk to the union rep. You should get a lawyer. A lawyer? As if the problem was something that could be solved by institutions, by systems designed to protect people like her. She almost laughed at the kind thought. Thank you, Brooke said again. Jennifer left her there with the supply cart, the metal edge pressing into her palms, leaving temporary crescents that would fade within an hour. That night, Brooke sat in her 2011 Hyundai Elantra in the hospital parking lot and watched the ER entrance. Ambulances arrived at irregular intervals, one at 6:22 p.m., another at 6:53. A third at 7:14. Emergency rooms run on the kind of clock that most people don't understand until they're looking at it from the inside. She reached into her jacket lining, into the small pocket she'd sewn there herself, and touched the faded unit patch. It was smaller than her thumbnail now, washed nearly grey from 18 years of contact with her skin, the colours barely distinguishable. What had once been black and gold now looked like old ash. No one could identify it now. No one could trace it. It was the only physical proof that Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan had ever existed, and she kept it the way soldiers keep talismans, not from faith, but from the desperate need to know she hadn't imagined the whole thing. She whispered to the darkness of her car, "Just stay invisible. Just keep your head down." The parking lot lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of yellow that made people look like they were drowning in piss. A siren wailed somewhere north of the hospital, growing closer, then fading. Coming or going, she couldn't tell. Webb's procedure was scheduled for 800 hours. 8 a.m. Hargrove would be there. The residents would be there. The allergy documentation was there. And Brooke would be there too, watching from a position she'd perfected over 3 years, close enough to help, far enough away to be invisible. The problem was that she'd never learned how to do nothing when someone was about to get hurt. She sat in her car for another hour, hands on the steering wheel, until the shift change came at midnight and the parking lot emptied out like the lot of people who'd made the decision to go home. The choice between self-preservation and the weight of knowing something. Just before 1 a.m., when the hospital was running on skeleton crew and the night had the particular silence that comes from exhaustion, Brooke went back inside. She pulled Webb's chart again, photographed the allergy documentation with her phone, wrote a formal addendum to the patient safety concern report about the antibiotic order, and submitted it to the system that had already failed him once. It didn't matter anymore whether they listened. It just mattered that she'd made the attempt. The morning light filtered through the surgical suite windows at 5:47 a.m., casting pale shadows across the preoperative holding area where Colonel Marcus Webb lay sedated on the gurney, his daughter Rachel's hand trembling as she pressed it against the cold metal rail one last time before the nurses wheeled him toward the cardiac catheterization lab. The fluorescent panels overhead hummed their mechanical song, that constant white noise of hospitals where life pivots on moments, and Brooke Sullivan moved through the medication room with the efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago that speed and silence were the same thing as invisibility. She pulled Webb's chart from the rack, her eye scanning the preoperative orders Hargrove had written the previous evening, orders that made her jaw tighten by a fraction of a millimeter, the only external sign that she'd noticed what everyone else had missed. The penicillin allergy. Documented. Red flagged. Yet Hargrove's pre-op antibiotic protocol listed cephalosporin, which meant cross-reactivity risk of 7 to 8% in patients with type 1 hypersensitivity. The margin between careful and catastrophic was measured in milligrams. She didn't hesitate. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of someone who'd made split-second medical decisions in Helm and Province while rounds from a PKM machine gun tore through mud brick walls, and she swapped the cephalosporin for a non-penicillin alternative, clindamycin, broad-spectrum, documented in Webb's allergy profile as safe, and hung it on the preoperative line without documentation, without notification, without anything that would leave a trace. It was a fireable offense. It was also a life-saving one. The syringe in her hand was steady as stone. The cardiac catheterization suite at 7:58 a.m. was all harsh white light and the whisper of air filtration systems, the operating table surrounded by surgical residents in sterile gowns, their eyes bright with the particular hunger of trainees watching a master surgeon at work. Dr. Hargrove scrubbed in with the theatrical precision of a man who'd performed this procedure 417 times, Brooke had counted, had reviewed his file with the methodical focus that made her dangerous, and the room fell into that specific silence that descends when a procedure begins. Webb was sedated, his chest prepped and draped, the cardiac monitor showing a steady rhythm of 72 beats per minute, his oxygen saturation at 98% on supplemental O2. Brooke stood near the instrument tray, her role reduced to handing supplies, to being present and invisible, the way she'd perfected over 3 years of making herself small enough to disappear. But that wasn't the worst part. Hargrove's phone sat on the edge of the sterile field, a violation, but one that residents said nothing about, and at 8:04 a.m., it buzzed. He glanced at it between changing gloves, his focus fragmenting for 3 seconds while he read a text message that Brooke couldn't see but whose impact she could measure in the slight shift of his attention, the way his hands moved with marginally less precision as he threaded the diagnostic catheter toward Webb's coronary arteries. She watched his face. She'd learned to read men in the 10 seconds before they made mistakes, in Helmand Province and in every moment since, and she saw the calculation there, the distraction, the sense that his institutional power was under threat from a nurse he'd already destroyed once and would destroy again if given the chance. The catheter advanced smoothly at first, the residents murmuring observations, the monitors showing normal pressure readings climbing along the left main coronary, the procedure routine and textbook and safe. And then Hargrove's phone buzzed again. His eyes flicked to it. The catheter continued advancing. The tip of the catheter, a thin flexible wire no thicker than spaghetti, slipped from the coronary artery into the muscular wall of the heart. The pericardium, the membrane surrounding the heart, accepted the needle like a wound. And the alarms began. The heart monitor screamed. A single sustained wail that made everyone in the suite go rigid. Webb's blood pressure dropped from 130/70 to 90/50 in 4 seconds, the numbers plummeting like an elevator with cut cables. "We've got cardiac tamponade," a resident called out, his voice climbing toward panic. Blood in the pericardial space, his gunner arrest. The monitors showed Webb's heart being slowly compressed by the blood filling the sac around it, the chamber walls unable to expand, the output crashing toward zero. 30 seconds. Maybe 40 before full cardiac arrest. Maybe. Hargrove stood frozen. His hands hung suspended above Webb's chest as if connected to a puppet master who'd released the strings. His face drained of color, the pink beneath his skin retreating until he looked carved from ash. The residents looked to him. The surgical nurses looked to him. Rachel, watching from the observation window above, made a sound like a wounded animal. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Brooke moved. She didn't ask permission. She didn't call code or wait for authorization or defer to the attending physician's authority. She crossed the 3 meters to the crash cart in one motion, her hand already knowing where the pericardiocentesis kit would be, the ultrasound, the needle, the drainage catheter, and she was back at Webb's side before Hargrove's brain had finished processing that she'd moved at all. Her left hand found the anatomical landmarks without looking, the xiphoid process at the base of the sternum, the angle below the rib cage, and she applied ultrasound gel with the efficiency of someone who'd done this procedure in a sandstorm with bullets overhead and screaming about contact left. The ultrasound showed the pericardial sac distended, blood-filled, the heart compressed like a fist inside a closing hand. She positioned the needle, 18 gauge, sharp enough to part tissue like it was butter, and she entered the pericardial space through the xiphoid approach, angling toward the left shoulder, feeling the subtle give as the needle penetrated the pericardium itself. Her hands moved on their own. No hesitation. No doubt. The hands of someone who'd held lives together in worse conditions than this. The needle advanced. 1 centimeter. 2. And then the syringe filled with blood. Venous blood, dark and viscous, flowing out of the pericardial sac as if a dam had broken. 200 cubic centimeters. The monitors changed their song. The screaming became steady. Webb's blood pressure climbed. 90/60. 100/65. 110/70. The heart rhythm stabilized into the clean sine wave of normal sinus rhythm, the oxygen saturation holding steady at 97%, the numbers turning from red to green and staying there. 20 seconds. That was all it took. 20 seconds from full cardiac arrest to stable resuscitation. The room exhaled. Rachel's hand pressed against the observation window so hard her knuckles went white. The resident stared at Brooke as if she'd just materialized from another dimension. And Hargrove looked at her, then at the blood-filled syringe in her steady hand, then at the residents who'd witnessed every second of the procedure, who'd seen exactly who'd frozen and exactly who'd moved. His face cycled through shock to something darker, something more dangerous. Calculation. Reassessment. The expression of a man realizing that he'd just been outmaneuvered in front of an audience he couldn't control. She didn't flinch. She didn't tremble. She simply held the syringe level and kept her eyes on the monitors, watching Webb's vital signs climb back toward the land of the living, and in that moment of perfect stillness, every person in the cardiac catheterization suite understood something fundamental. She'd just saved his life. She'd also just performed a procedure that existed in the space between necessary and prosecutable, and she'd done it with at least 4 witnesses, each one of whom would have a different memory of what they'd seen, a different interpretation of whether she'd acted under her nursing scope or crossed into territory only physicians were permitted to occupy. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the monitors went haywire. Hargrove's face shifted. Not shock, calculation. His hand moved to his phone before the last beep even registered. He stepped back from the bedside, let the resident see him turn away first, already composing the narrative. A junior physician had overstepped. A nurse had acted beyond scope. He was the victim of an insubordinate staff member who'd just created catastrophic liability exposure for Oak Creek Memorial. By the time Brooke had finished securing the drainage line, Hargrove was already texting board members, his thumbs moving with the precision of a man who'd built his career on knowing exactly which strings to pull. Within 60 minutes, Morrison and Chen arrived in hospital administration, 2 board members with the kind of expensive posture that came from sitting on committees and corporate boards, the kind of men who saw patient safety concerns as threats rather than opportunities. They didn't look at the vitals or ask what had happened. They sat across from Hargrove in the conference room on the 3rd floor with its mahogany table and climate control that smelled like old money and newer anxiety. She performed an unauthorized procedure, Hargrove said, spreading the documentation like a dealer laying cards. Physician-only technique. Cardiac pericardiocentesis. She touched equipment she's not credentialed to touch. I have 4 witnesses. Morrison leaned forward. What's our exposure? Full investigation. State board complaint filed this morning, insubordination, scope violation, pattern of defiance dating back 3 written warnings. I've documented everything. The hospital is protected if we terminate immediately and cooperate with the state board. Chen nodded. Emergency meeting. Get security involved. The machinery had started. Hargrove's network wasn't built on single acts of cruelty, it was built on institutional leverage. Morrison sat on the hospital board. Chen had connections to the Virginia Medical Board. One phone call from Hargrove to the State Nursing Division, citing an authorized performance of a physician-level procedure, would trigger a formal complaint that would stay in Brooke's file for years, regardless of outcome. The complaint didn't require proof of harm. It just required the allegation. And the allegation, Hargrove knew, would be impossible to fully defend without revealing classified details of her military service that she could never discuss. The system worked exactly as designed, especially when you knew how to weaponize it. An hour later, Rachel Webb tried to intercede. She found Morrison in the hallway outside the administrator's office, her face flushed with the kind of anger that came from watching someone save your father's life and then get destroyed for it. She saved my father, Rachel said. Her voice didn't shake. If she hadn't acted, he would have died on that table. Morrison looked at her with the expression of a man who'd learned to absorb objections without actually hearing them. Your father's care was being managed by Dr. Hargrove. Ms. Sullivan exceeded her authority. She saved his life. She exceeded her authority, Morrison repeated, as though volume might turn the words into logic. This hospital has liability exposure. There will be an investigation. It wasn't a conversation. It was a closing statement. Security appeared at the nurse's station at 2:19 p.m. with an empty cardboard box. Brooke was in the supply room, and still carrying the muscle memory of the procedure, the needle insertion, the hiss of air escaping, the blood darkening the syringe. Her hands weren't shaking from fear. They were shaking from the transition, from dropping one identity and preparing for another. She'd done this before. Afghanistan to anonymous. Known to erased. Active duty to civilian silence. Martinez, the older security guard who'd worked at Oak Creek for 19 years and had once helped her carry supplies during a 12-hour trauma shift, appeared in the doorway. His face carried the weight of a man who understood what was happening but couldn't stop it. "I'm sorry, Sullivan," he said quietly. "They want you out now." She nodded once. No argument. No question. Just acknowledgement. The box sat on the break room table. Brooke packed methodically. Her stethoscope, a Littman Cardiology 4, the expensive kind she'd bought with her first Navy paycheck, engraved with initials that weren't quite her legal name. A photograph of her son Derek in his Navy dress whites, commissioned as a medic last year, his face carrying the same controlled calm she'd spent 30 years perfecting. Her jacket, the one with the faded Special Forces unit patch she'd cut from the sleeve lining 14 years ago, the only physical proof she'd ever served in a unit that officially didn't exist. Hargrove watched from his office doorway, arms crossed. Not triumphant, confident. He'd done this before. Removed obstacles. Controlled narratives. Purged his unit of anyone who didn't fall in line. Jennifer and 2 other nurses watched from the break room, their eyes deliberately downcast. Colleagues became irrelevant once you were labeled a liability. That was another rule Brooke understood. The walk through the lobby took for minutes. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead with their particular frequency that survivors learn to tune out during crisis shifts. Patients and families watched, some with curiosity, some with the hollowed recognition of people who'd already witnessed institutional power dismantling individual lives. A woman in a waiting chair held her phone up, maybe recording, maybe just needing proof that something had happened. Brooke took one measured breath at the automatic doors. No tears. The trembling she felt was old muscle memory from a different life, not weakness from this one. She'd been stripped of identity before. She'd survived it. 3 days passed with the deliberate slowness of disconnection. The VA hospital in Norfolk occupied a low brick building on 40 acres, the kind of place built during Kennedy's administration and maintained by people who understood that the building's physical deterioration was metaphor for the way institutions forgot their own. The waiting room smelled like old coffee and floor polish, industrial, impersonal, the scent of waiting for something to become official. Brooke sat in one of the plastic chairs, surrounded by veterans. A young Marine with a prosthetic leg, the socket still marked with raw skin around the edges. An Army sergeant with burn scars mapping his right arm in shades of purple and pink. A woman in a wheelchair, no visible wounds, but her hands gripped the armrests with the kind of pressure that came from surviving things that left no marks. A man her age, maybe 50s, staring at the floor like it held answers. She was waiting for her monthly PTSD appointment, the one she'd been attending for 4 years, ever since she'd transferred out of active duty and tried to build a civilian life that didn't require lying about who she was. The sessions helped. The therapist, Dr. Reeves, was a woman who'd worked at Bethesda National Naval Medical Center for 15 years and could recognize a black Operation PTSD signature at 30 paces, the kind of complex trauma that came from classified work, impossible choices, and the silence that followed. In her lap, Brooke held the faded Special Forces unit patch she'd cut from her jacket lining that morning. It was the size of her hand, maybe 4 inches across, the gold thread now tarnished to copper, the fabric worn soft from 40 years of ceremonial wear. The insignia was still visible if you knew what you were looking for: the arrowhead, the dagger, the motto she could no longer speak aloud without technically violating her discharge papers. This patch was the only proof she'd ever served. The only tangible evidence that the years in Helmand Province, the operations conducted under call sign Angel 6, the Afghan medic whose brother she'd operated on in the street while mortars landed 50 meters away, the machine gun ambush she'd pulled 12 soldiers out of using a Humvee and a hand signal, and the kind of calm that came from having already accepted death, the only proof that any of it had actually happened. Her military records had been erased. Not redacted. Erased. The Navy had a process for black operations personnel. You were removed from official records when the operation was classified retroactively, when the unit designation became too sensitive, when the work you'd done required that you'd never officially done it at all. She received her discharge papers, her VA benefits paperwork, her medical records marked service member with no unit designation, no rank notation, no operational history. Just a series of dates and medical codes and the federal seal that meant the government had officially forgotten her. The patch was what remained. Brooke turned it over in her hands, the way she did 3 times a week in her apartment, the way she did during shift breaks before everything fell apart. The thread was coming loose on one edge. If she wasn't careful, the whole thing would unravel. The waiting room's television showed the noon news without sound, a local story about hospital administration, something about nursing shortages, stock footage of emergency rooms. Brooke didn't watch. She studied the patch, the evidence of 18 years of service that had been officially declared never to have happened. Her name was called Sullivan. She stood, put the patch in her jacket pocket, and followed the nurse down the hallway toward Dr. Reeves' office. The hallway smelled like disinfectant and something else, the particular scent of institutions that held broken people, the combination of hope and resignation that no amount of cleaning could remove. She didn't know that 34 miles away, an emergency transport was approaching Oak Creek Memorial with a patient named Farhan Ahmadi, 43, Afghan national, shrapnel wound, legal permanent resident, and the only person left alive who could prove that the Angel of Helmand had ever existed. She didn't know that Colonel Webb was about to make a phone call to his son Derek. She didn't know that the dog tags Webb wore in Helmand Province, the ones he'd kept for 14 years for the exact moment when he might finally find her, were about to become the proof that silenced a hospital. Brooke sat in Dr. Reeves' office and held the faded patch in her hands while the world, for another few hours, remained exactly as it had been, forgetful, indifferent, and entirely ignorant of the truth. The emergency transfer came through at 2:24 p.m. on a Tuesday. A man named Farhan Ahmadi, shrapnel wound, left anterior chest, classified status. Oak Creek Memorial's trauma bay wheezed with preparation as nurses prepped the isolation room adjacent to Colonel Webb's suite. Brooke was 3 miles away, sitting in the VA waiting room with her PTSD paperwork unsigned, when her phone buzzed. A text from Jennifer, "They're asking for you." Webb's asking. Don't know why yet. She didn't go back to Oak Creek that day. She couldn't. Security had walked her out with her belongings in a cardboard box. The state nursing board was investigating. Hargrove had filed the complaint himself, insubordination, scope violation, endangering a patient. The irony tasted like copper. She'd saved a man's life and lost everything for it. The next morning, a sedan pulled into the VA parking lot. Military plates. 2 men in dress uniforms stepped out. They weren't hospital staff. They were Navy Office of Inspector General, and they were carrying a classified file folder marked Operation Silent River, Eyes Only. They found Brooke in the cafeteria, still in civilian clothes, the faded unit patch folded in her pocket like a prayer card no one was meant to see. Senior Chief Sullivan, the taller one, said. It wasn't a question. His voice was steady as a rifle sight. We need to talk about what happened in that cardiac catheterization suite. But that wasn't the real story. Not yet. Farhan Ahmadi regained consciousness at 3:40 p.m., 16 hours after surgery. The shrapnel had missed his lungs by centimeters, a margin of luck that meant nothing in the language of death. The room was quiet except for the ventilator's mechanical breathing, the steady percussion of the heart monitor, the fluorescent lights humming their endless hymn. A Navy corpsman stood outside, orders to keep the patient isolated. No visitors. No exceptions. Those were Commander Park's orders, and when a Navy commander gave orders at a civilian hospital, Oak Creek Memorial listened. Brooke didn't know any of this yet. What she knew was that the OIG agents had taken her to a secure room on the 3rd floor of the VA, the kind of space that existed between official records. They'd shown her satellite imagery from Helmand Province dated August 2009. They'd shown her a redacted roster of her unit with her name still visible underneath the redaction, like a scar tissue that could never quite heal. They'd showed her her own service record, the one that didn't exist, the one the Navy had told her to forget. "Someone's been asking questions," the first agent said. "About the Angel of Helmand. About a medic who performed miracles and then disappeared." The second agent opened the file. Inside was a photograph. Farhan Ahmadi. Young face, Taliban insignia on his sleeve, standing beside 3 other fighters. One of them had a bandage across his chest, crude, field-applied, the kind that would have let him bleed out in another 4 hours. "This man," the agent said. "His name is Mirza Ahmadi. Your patient's brother. You saved his life in Sanjan Valley, November 2009. Taliban medic. Shouldn't have mattered. Your orders were to treat Americans only." "I was a medic," Brooke said. Her voice was quiet. It wasn't meek, meekness required doubt. This was something else. This was composure made of titanium. Not a politician. The agents exchanged a look. The kind of look that meant they'd been looking for her for a very long time. Farhan Ahmadi woke the second time to find a man in a wheelchair at the foot of his bed. Colonel Marcus Webb. Dressed in civilian clothes, his daughter Rachel standing behind him, her hand on his shoulder like an anchor. His son Derek in dress uniform beside them. Behind Derek stood another man in dress uniform, darker eyes, the kind that had seen things that had no names in English. Commander Parks, Special Operations Command Atlantic, the man who'd ordered Farhan's transfer to Oak Creek Memorial in the first place. "You know her," Webb said. "Not a question." Farhan's face went the color of old ivory. His hands trembled on the blanket. When he spoke, his English fractured like thin ice. "You are the American woman. The one they called Angel of Helmand. You saved my brother when your commanders said to let him die." His voice cracked on the last word. "When your commanders said to let him die, you did not listen." The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside, hammering the Norfolk streets like artillery. Derek's hand went to his chest. Rachel's eyes widened. Webb leaned forward in his wheelchair, fingers gripping the armrest. "My brother lived because of you," Farhan continued, each word a stone placed deliberately in the silence. "He lived. He married. He has 3 children. They exist because you chose to be human instead of American." "Where is he now?" Brooke asked. But she wasn't in the room. She was in the VA cafeteria still, with the OIG agents, about to have her entire erased history handed back to her like a classified file returning from the dead. Derek walked into Oak Creek Memorial's administrative conference room at 4:15 p.m. carrying a leather portfolio. Behind him came a woman in a dark suit, a Jennifer Valdez, the prosecutor from Norfolk's Veterans Advocacy Network. Behind her came a man in Navy dress uniform with captain's insignia. Behind him came Commander Parks. And behind all of them, moving with the terrible fluid grace of someone who'd crossed more borders than most countries contained, came a woman with eyes the color of storm clouds and hands that had held lives together in the dark. Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. The hospital administrator, Dr. Morrison, went pale. The board attorney stood. Even Hargrove, who'd been called in to discuss the Sullivan situation before being terminated, seemed to understand in that moment that he'd made a calculation error of apocalyptic proportions. "My mother," Derek said. His voice broke on the word. "My mother pulled my entire squad out of an ambush in Paktia province. We were pinned. No air support. No extraction available. She moved through fire without cover, treated for men with catastrophic wounds, and pulled us out on foot. Through mountains. For 16 kilometers. In the dark." The room didn't just go silent. The silence developed weight. Texture. The kind of silence that preceded catastrophe. Rachel pulled up a video on her phone. Shaky footage, shot from the observation window. The catheterization suite. Dr. Hargrove, distracted, texting, his left hand casual while his right guided the catheter. The moment the needle nicked the pericardium. The monitors screaming. And then Brooke, smaller than anyone expected, movements precise as a surgeon's prayer, hands moving on their own because muscle memory doesn't forget. She'd inserted the needle at the 5th intercostal space, subcostal approach, and drawn fluid from around Colonel Webb's heart the way someone drawing water from a well in the dark knew exactly where the well was without looking. She performed an emergency pericardiocentesis, the Navy captain said. Without equipment. Without assistance. Without authorization. In a cardiac catheterization suite where the commanding physician wasn't paying attention because he was texting about personnel matters. 2 silver stars, Commander Park said. His voice was quiet, which made it more terrible than if he'd shouted. For operations in Helmand Province. First one, combat rescue of 18 Marines in Marja. Second one, extraction of a Special Forces medical unit under fire. Bronze Star with Valor, for medical care provided under active combat conditions. 2 Purple Hearts. 1 for shrapnel wound in Kandahar. 1 for IED fragmentation in Logar Province. Hargrove's face drained of color like someone had opened a valve. He understood now. Not fully. He wouldn't understand fully until the federal investigators arrived and the classified files came out and his career wasn't just over but transformed into a cautionary tale about what happened when a man let his ego make a diagnosis. But he understood enough. He understood that he'd tried to destroy something that belonged to the government, something the government had spent 2 decades protecting and hiding and erasing from the record. FBI is en route, the woman in the dark suit said. They're executing warrants on your office and home right now, Dr. Hargrove. Your communications, your financial records, your board contacts. The State Nursing Board has suspended their investigation. Oak Creek Memorial's Board of Directors is implementing an emergency session at 5 p.m. to address the wrongful termination of Senior Chief Sullivan and the potential criminal negligence during the catheterization procedure. Morrison stood. Dr. Hargrove, you're suspended pending investigation. Immediately. No contact with staff. No access to. I know the way, Hargrove said. His voice was flat. Erased. He'd become invisible too, in that moment. Just a man who'd picked the wrong nurse to humiliate. Martinez appeared in the doorway. The same security guard who'd handed Brooke her belongings box 3 days ago. He was holding an identical box now. Behind him came 4 uniformed officers. Martinez's eyes met Brooke's for a single moment, an apology and recognition in the same glance. Then he turned to Hargrove and spoke with quiet satisfaction, I believe you know the way out, Doctor. Hargrove walked out. His residents watched from the hallways. Jennifer watched from the break room. No one helped him pack. No one saluted. The only sound was his shoes on the tile, clicking like a countdown timer running backward. Brooke was officially reinstated with full rank recognition, back pay for 3 years of erased service, and a position as Chief of Nursing at Oak Creek Memorial. Not a punishment. Not a mercy. A reckoning. The kind that had to be absolute to mean anything at all. 6 months later, a woman in a crisp navy dress uniform stood outside a strip mall in Norfolk. Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, heading to a Pentagon ceremony where the Medal of Honor was waiting. Colonel Webb's dog tags hung around her neck, pressed into her palm at the hospital that day with the words, You saved my life twice, Senior Chief. Once in 2009 in Helmand Province. Once in a cardiac catheterization suite where she'd refused to let a man's arrogance become another patient's grave. She glanced through the window of Coastal Insurance Solutions. Dr. Hargrove sat at a folding table with a fishbowl for business cards. Cheap suit. No customers. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged business cards in the fishbowl like it mattered. Like it changed anything. He looked up. Saw her uniform. Saw the medals. Saw the dog tags. His face crumbled like paper held too close to fire. Brooke didn't go inside. She simply nodded once, one measured breath, and walked to her car where Derek waited in dress uniform, Rachel beside him, Webb in his wheelchair. They were all attending the ceremony. At the Pentagon, under lights that would have made a sniper's work impossible, a 4-star admiral would pin the medal on her uniform. The crowd would stand. Derek would salute his mother. Webb would salute from his wheelchair. 100 wounded veterans would stand if they could, all saluting the woman who'd saved her own soul by saving theirs. But that was 6 months away. Today, Brooke simply drove. And as the rain began to fall on Norfolk streets, hammering like applause no one had asked for, she understood something that no paperwork could contain: heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. Sometimes pushing mops. Sometimes sitting in wheelchairs. Sometimes standing at a window in dress uniform, letting someone see that they'd been seen, and that seeing mattered more than any words ever could. This story deserves to be shared. If you know someone like Brooke, quiet strength, hidden sacrifice, service rendered in silence, tell them their story matters. Tell them you see them. And if you've ever been underestimated by a system that didn't know your value, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to remember that truth finds a way. Like, comment, and let us know, have you ever stood beside a hero without knowing?